cs2.com. cs2.com.
Time to look at the bubble sort algorithm. The bubble sort algorithm is designed to take an array that is out of order and put it into order. Let's say you're programming a video game and you're tracking everybody's high score, and you don't want to know who has the greatest or the largest score. Well, you can put that in an array, sort it, and who's ever at the end has the high score. You'll also find the low score at the beginning of the array. Bubble sort. Take data in an array that is out of order and put it into order. I wrote the code for bubble sort here. This time I made sure I put in the curly braces because it's a little more complicated code. We're going to set up a variable called outer and set it equal to array length -1. And what that's going to do is kind of give us a target. All right? The goal of bubble sort is to bubble or move the largest number we can find to this outer position. So I'm going to go through this data and move the largest piece of data I can find to this outer position. Outer greater than 1, well, 4 is greater than 1 is a true statement. As a true statement, we will execute this loop. We'll jump into the inner loop, set inner equal to 0, and that means we want to start at the beginning of the array. 0 less than 4 is a true statement. As a true statement, we're going to go inside the for loop, follow the arrows on this one, and we're going to ask if the array of inner is greater than the array of inner plus 1. The way this algorithm works is it slides down the array and compares two adjacent numbers, and if those two numbers are out of order, it swaps them. If they're not out of order, it leaves them alone. 20 greater than 30 is a false statement. 20 and 30 are not out of order. So what it decides to do is nothing. As a false statement, it is going to take this path and skip the swap. Those two numbers are in order. Leave them alone. And that's good. Bubble sort likes it when it leaves the number alone. After the if statement, we'll hit the end of this inner loop. Notice how I put a comment in there to say this is the inner loop. That's the inner loop right there, controlled by the variable inner. We hit the end of the inner loop. That means we got to spin back up under this inner for loop. When we spin back up on the inner for loop, we'll execute an inner plus plus. We're going down the length of the array like we typically do with an array. Inner plus plus goes to 1. That's pointing to there. 1 less than 4 is still a true statement. Into the for loop we go, and we ask if array sub inner is greater than array inner plus 1. Is 30 greater than 50? And the answer to that, once again, is false. These two numbers are not out of order, so leave them alone. We'll skip the if statement, jump to the end of the if statement. When we hit the end of the if statement, we'll go to the end of the inner loop here. When we hit the end of the inner loop, we'll loop back up on our inner for loop. When we get to our inner for loop, we'll add 1 to inner. We'll slide farther down the array to position 2. 2 less than 4 is still a true statement. As a true statement, we're going inside this for loop again. Now it gets interesting. Array sub inner, which is 50, is that greater than array sub inner plus 1, which is 10? That is a true statement. 50 and 10 are out of order. Somebody needs to fix it. And that's what that if statement will do. Since this was a true statement, it's going inside the loop. It sets up a temporary variable in temp here, and it takes array sub inner, that 50, and moves it to the temporary variable. Once 50 has safely moved to temporary, it's going to move the 10 at array sub inner plus 1. That's the 10 right there, inner plus 1. It's going to move it over to array sub inner. It's going to wipe out the 50 that was here before. But don't worry about that 50. It's safely in temp. We'll take it from temp and move it to inner plus 1. What we just executed there was called a swap. When you want to swap two numbers in the array, you want two numbers to change places in the array, it takes a third variable and 3 assignments to do it. So we shifted the 50 out, we moved the 10 over, and then the 50 replaced or swapped with 10. At the end of the if statement, what are we going to do? We're going to advance to the end of the inner loop. When we reach the end of the inner loop, what are we going to do? Why, we're going to loop back up to this for statement again. Inner plus plus takes us to position 3 of the array. Again, we're sliding down this array, swapping numbers that are out of order. 3 less than 4 is still a true statement. As a true statement, we're going to go inside this loop and execute the if statement again. Array sub inner contains a 50. Is that greater than array sub inner plus 1? All we're doing is comparing adjacent numbers, and if they're out of order, we want this to be true. And that's the case. 50 and 40 are out of order, so the statement is true. We're going inside the if statement to do our swap. And these 3 statements represent our swap. 50 and 40 are out of order. Swap them. The 50 in array sub inner gets sent to the temporary variable. The 40 at inner plus 1 moves over to replace the 50 right there. And then the 50 comes back down out of the temporary variable into the array, and 40 and 50 just swapped or changed places. When we're done with the if statement, we'll go to the end of the for loop, the inner for loop. When we're at the end of the inner for loop, we pop back up and do it again because that's what for loops do. Inner plus plus will take us to 4. That's interesting. Now when we look at inner less than outer, that is a false statement. We reach the end of the line. After one pass through this array, 50, our largest number, is in our outer or target position. We don't need to go any farther. It's time to exit this for loop. When we exit the inner for loop, we'll hit the end of the outer for loop. When we hit the end of the outer for loop, we pop back up here, and we're going to do outer minus minus. Now, see how I kept that outer pointer there? Outer stays there as long as we're going down the array. Now it's time to change that. The outer minus minus will tend to 3, and what we're going to do is repeat the same thing. We are going to move the largest number we can find to this position, position 3. 3 greater than 1 is a true statement, so we'll enter the outer loop and execute the inner loop. Inner loop starts over from the beginning, and we'll go down the line, moving the largest number it can find to position outer. 0 less than 3 is now a true statement, so I'll execute the if. 20 greater than 30 is a false statement, so I'll skip the swap. When I hit the end of the inner loop, I spin back up. When I spin back up, inner plus plus says go to position 1. Something's going to happen here. 1 less than 3 is a true statement. As a true statement, it will enter the for loop and execute the if. Array sub inner 30 greater than array sub inner plus 1, that is a true statement. 30 and 10 are out of position, so it's time to swap 30 and 10. The temporary variable gets array sub inner. Array sub inner plus 1 moves over to array sub inner, so the 10 slides over and wipes out the 30. But don't feel bad about the 30. It safely moves back from the temp variable to my array, and 10 and 30 just swap positions in the array. Are you starting to see the sort going on here? If you look closely at those last 3 numbers, they look like they're in order. We'll hit the end of the if statement, which will reach at the end of the inner for loop. The end of the inner for loop takes us back up to top. Inner plus plus takes us to 2, and now inner will be pointing at slot 2 or index 2 of the array. Array sub inner greater than array sub inner minus plus 1 is 30 greater than 40. That is a false statement. We're going to compare adjacent numbers, and every time they're out of order, swap them. Well, they're not out of order. 30 and 40 are in perfect order. So skip the swap, hit the end of the inner loop, At the end of the inner loop, we'll come back up and do an inner plus plus. When inner plus plus goes to 3, notice how we've reached the end. Notice how inner and outer are pointing to the same position. 3 less than 3 is a false statement. We've now gone through this inner loop twice, and look what we have. We have the 2 largest numbers at the end of the array. We'll hit the end of the outer for loop and say spin back up on the outer for loop. Outer minus minus is going to change our target. Outer minus minus is going to set outer equal to 2 and say scan the data and move the largest number you can find to position 2. 2 greater than 1 is a true statement, so we're going to go inside the loop and execute the inner loop. Inner once again starts over at 0. Every time through the inner loop it starts over at 0. Start at position 0 and go to outer, swapping numbers when you see they're out of order. 0 less than 2 is a true statement, so we'll go to the if statement. When we get to the if statement, array sub inner 20, is that greater than array sub inner plus 1, which is 10? Very much a true statement. As a true statement, it's going to go inside the if statement and execute the swap. The 20 at position 0 gets moved to temp. The 10 moves over in the array and wipes out the 20 in the array. But don't feel bad about the 20. It's safely in the temporary variable and moves back down to array inner plus 1. 10 and 20 just swapped. We reach the end of the swap, which means the next line of code that executes is the end of the inner loop. The end of the inner loop takes us back up to the top of the inner loop. Inner plus plus goes to 1. 1 less than 2 is a true statement, so we're going inside and checking that if statement once again. Array sub inner 20, is that greater than array sub inner plus 1, which is 30? Absolutely not. Those two numbers are not out of order. Leave them alone. Skip the if. When you reach the end of the if, go to the end of the inner for loop. When you reach the end of the inner loop for loop, go back to the top of the inner for loop. Do an inner plus plus, which takes us to 2. Inner less than outer. 2 less than 2 is clearly a false statement. As a false statement, we will exit the for loop. When we exit the inner for loop, we'll reach the outer for loop. When we reach the outer for loop, we'll spin back up and execute outer minus minus. Outer minus minus takes us to 1. 1 greater than 1 is a false statement. When this statement goes to false, what happens? We need to exit the outer loop. And when we exit the outer loop, our sort is done. Did you see it? This data started in mixed up order. It was out of order. By spinning through these 2 loops, we placed it in order. That's what we call a bubble sort. A bubble sort bubbles the biggest number it can find to the end of the array. Then it repeats the same process, moving the biggest number it can find to a position 1 less than the end of the array. And it repeats it again to the next position, and so on down the line. When you get down to position 1, your data is going to be in order. Well, I hope you enjoyed that lesson. Once again, I'm Professor Chris Ferguson. Please visit us at gamesci.com to see more interesting lessons.